Hi everyone, welcome to our very first lecture of the term. So today we're going to cover our chapter 1, and then the next video will cover chapter 2 of your textbook. I do want to point out when you are watching these videos, I highly recommend that you download the course objectives and have those in front of you to take your notes with. So the course objectives are just a way that you can concentrate your the understanding of the material into focusing on the most important aspects of the chapter. So sometimes when we take notes, we don't know exactly what to take notes on. So this will concentrate on the information that is most relevant for this course. So as you go through the video, you basically just fill in the information as we go through it. Sometimes in the course objectives, you'll notice there are some check for understanding questions. So I don't cover those in the video. So you'll just need to, kind of go back and think about it, or you can pause the video and answer those questions and so forth. So it's just a way to make sure you understand the information that was presented. Another thing that you can do if you don't really like taking notes using that method is to download my PowerPoint slides in a PDF file. So these, this week 1 lecture presentation are the same slides that I use to lecture on, so you can have the slides in front of you and take notes directly on them as you watch the video. So that's another way that you can take your notes. Okay, so however you want to take them, we're going to go ahead and get started with our first chapter. Oops. So let's get that going. All right, so again, we're going to, this is our first unit, so we're going to cover chapters 1 and 2 of your textbook. Today, we're only going to cover chapter 1. So chapter 1 is kind of an overview of what you're going to be studying for the next 10 weeks. So in this chapter, we're mainly going to explore the common themes of life. So things like, what all living things have in common, and what makes living things alive. We will also dive into a little bit of evolution. So evolution is why we have so many different species and so much variety of life. And then we'll get into how we study life using the scientific method. So let's start out by talking about what biology is. So we're going to be spending the next 10 weeks studying life. So that's what biology is, the scientific study of life. And we're going to take a closer look at basically what constitutes life. And one thing that we're going to notice is that organisms, they tend to have adaptations to the environment that they live in. And those adaptations are the result of evolution. So for example, we see 2 mice species here. Actually, they're the same exact species. They just have 2 different populations. One happens to live in this kind of beach environment where the soil substrate is sandy. And then this other population of the same species of mice lives a little further inland. So you can see that the substrate is a little different coloration. And over time, these 2 populations, they adapted to their surroundings. So the population towards the beach, they have a lighter coloration in their coat color to blend into the white sand of the beach. Whereas the inland environment is more brown, and so the population of mice have adapted to that by being more of that browny color, and that's going to allow them to camouflage better in that particular environment. So we can see that evolution is a process of change that has resulted in all sorts of different variety of life, even amongst the same species. So as biologists, we are constantly asking questions about the life around us. So for example, you might ask a question about how does a single cell develop into an entire organism? Okay, maybe we'll answer that this term. How does the human mind work? Why are there so many different forms of life in a forest? And how do they interact? So those are all some questions that biologists might study in studying life. Okay. So let's start out by talking about the unifying themes of biology. So these 5 themes of biology unify all living things together. So all living things have some sort of organization to them. All living things have genetic information. All living things utilize energy and matter. All living things interact with each other as well as the environment. And all living things, well, populations of living things evolve. So we're going to go through each one of these common themes. We're going to start with organization. So with organization, we're going to look at how each individual organism is organized and then how all life together as a whole is organized. So in order to study organization, we're going to watch a little video. So you'll notice throughout the term, I like to use these Amoeba Sisters videos to explain some of these concepts. This is a YouTube series that, is very fun and educational that you might be interested in looking at on your own. So it's just, you just go to YouTube, type in Amoeba Sisters, and they have all of these biology related videos. So if you're ever stuck on a topic, you might, see if you can look up a video on it, an Amoeba Sisters video. So let's start out by watching this one on the biological levels of organization of life.
If I asked you to describe the biological levels of organization, could you do it? What would those levels be? Actually, what would be the point about caring about them in the first place? Well, biological systems are composed of many levels, and we care about them because when these levels are analyzed, it's possible to relate the levels not only to each other, but the whole system. All of our videos tend to focus on one or more of these levels, which is why we have chosen to make this video come first in our biology playlist. The first level that we are going to start with is the most basic living level that makes up all of life. It is the cell. Now, can something be smaller than a cell? Sure. For the cells that contain organelles, the organelles are obviously smaller than the cell they are contained in. Biomolecules are smaller than cells. We learn about biomolecules as they are major non-living components within cells. Atoms are smaller than a cell. You can even get smaller than atoms when considering subatomic particles. But for this video, we are going to start at the cellular level, a basic living unit. It doesn't matter whether you're talking about bacteria, archaea, fungi, protists, plants, or animals. If you're talking about something alive, you're talking about something made up of one or more cells. Now, when you have a lot of cells that are working together for a combined function, you end up with the next level, tissues. An example of tissue includes cardiac muscle tissue, which would be made up of many cardiac muscle cells. Tissues make up organs, which is our third level. You have a lot of organs in your body. An example of an organ would include your heart. When you have multiple organs working together, you end up with the next level, an organ system. Consider the digestive system. It includes your stomach, the small intestine, the large intestine, liver, etc. These particular organs work together to help you digest your food and to use the food for energy that you need for all kinds of cell processes. The digestive system is just one example of an organ system. But tie in all of the organ systems, and what do you get? An individual, an organism, like you, or this platypus. He's got organ systems too. Now, if you have a lot of platypus together, what's the plural of platypus? According to dictionary.com, you can say platypi, which sounds especially fancy. And you have a population. This population of platypi can breed with each other. And they're all the same species. It's a platypi population. Great YouTube channel name right there. But include other populations such as fish, algae, and plants along with the platypi, and now you have a community. A community includes many populations, but it does not include abiotic factors. Abiotic factors are factors that are non-living, like rocks. abiotic factors are not considered in the community level, just biotic factors. Biotic factors, on the other hand, are living. When abiotic factors are considered, such as the rocks, the temperature of this environment, the water, and the biotic factors, such as all the organisms we mentioned before, we now have an ecosystem. Well, it turns out that many ecosystems can be found in different regions on the globe. If talking about this collectively, you are at the level of biome. An example is a desert biome or a rainforest biome. You will find desert ecosystems or rainforest ecosystems in multiple places on the globe. But when talking about a desert biome or a rainforest biome, you are considering all of these ecosystems. Now, what happens when you put all the biomes together? Well, now you are talking about the level of the biosphere. The biosphere includes anywhere on our planet where life is supported. It is the sum of all of the biomes, all the areas where organisms live. Well, we're finished with our tour of the biological levels of organization, but remember, this is just an overview. The more biology you learn, the more you will discover how these levels relate to each other and the whole system. That's it for the Amoeba Sisters, and we remind you to stay curious.
All right. So again, I like to use these videos just because they're fun and they actually go through basically everything that we need. So let's go ahead and review what was discussed in the video with our hierarchical organization of life. So in the video, they started with cells as the lowest level of the hierarchy of life. And that's because cells are the smallest unit of life. Okay, so meaning that if we get smaller than a cell, it's not considered alive. Okay, so here we have number 8 on our list is cells. But there's things that are smaller than cells that are found inside of cells, but they're not considered life. They're not considered alive. Okay, so that's why the video started with cells. But if we take a look inside of the cells, we're going to see, particularly with our own cells, organelles. So think of this term organelle as organs of a cell. So basically, they're the different components found inside of the cell, and each component has a different job. So each organelle has a different job. And then these organelles are made up of molecules, which the video explained. Okay, so we're getting basically to the smallest part of the hierarchical organization. But just remember that organelles and molecules are not considered alive, even though they are part of hierarchical organization. So cells are the smallest unit of life. And you can see here, we have an example of a plant cell. Okay, so you can see inside that plant cell, there are different organelles, such as the chloroplast. That's what makes them green, because that's the site of photosynthesis. And then inside the organelles, we have different molecules that make that up. Okay, so cells are the smallest unit of life. Now, if we have a bunch of cells together with a common function, we call that tissue. So tissue is moving up a little higher on our hierarchical organization of life. So tissue is a group of cells with a common function. And then if we have multiple tissues working together, they form an organ. So we actually have 4 different types of tissues in the human body. We have epithelial tissue, connective tissue, muscle tissue, and nervous tissue. And you don't need to know any of those, but just saying that our organs are made up of some of these different types of tissue. So for example, your skin is made up of all 4 types of that tissue. So skin would be an organ of your body. So organs are made up of multiple types of tissue, and tissue are made up of multiple types of cells. And then if we have a bunch of organs working together within the organism, we call that our organism. So our organism would be, for example, our flowering plant. Looks like lupin or something right here. So that's made up of a different organs, and in plants that could be an example of like a leaf and a stem and a root and flowers. In a human body, our different organs could be our stomach and our esophagus and our lungs and our heart. So they're all working together to allow us to survive, right? So the next level of organization is the organism. That's made up of organs, which are made of tissue, which are made of cells. Okay. Now, if we have a bunch of organisms together in the same area that are of the same species, we call that a population. So populations are organisms of the same species living together in the same area. So here's a population of lupin in, say, a meadow. Now, if we add the other organisms within the lupins, such as other wildflowers, and look, you can even see a deer. Okay, so in that case, we're looking at what's called a community. So communities are different species interacting with each other. So it could be plant species, it could be animal species, it could be bacterial species, fungi, all of the different living things interacting together. They form a community. So sometimes students get a little tricked up on community and population. Communities for us, we think, oh, you know, like where we live. But a community in the biological level, it includes all of the living species, whereas a population is where we live with our common species. Okay. And then finally, we get to looking at the community and how it interacts with the abiotic environment. So, for example, we have this meadow here that's in a valley, and so it's going to be influenced by the amount of rainfall, the amount of cloud cover, the soil, the air temperature, all sorts of things. So all of those abiotic factors influence the biotic factors. So when we bring in those abiotic factors, we're talking about an ecosystem. And then finally, when we have all of the ecosystems on Earth, we think of the living sphere or the biosphere. So the biosphere is basically the living part of our globe that includes all of the different ecosystems. So we can see with our life's hierarchy how every living thing, every organism is organized within itself, and then every organism is organized within our entire biosphere. So this is the hierarchy of life. So let's do a checkpoint question. Which of these levels of biological organization includes all of the others in the list? So the list includes cell, molecule, organ, and organelle. So which one of these includes all of the others? If you chose organ, I would agree with you. So organs are made of tissue, which is made of cells, which are made of organelles, which are made of molecules. So organs include all of these. Okay? All right, so we talked about the hierarchical organization of life. So let's look at more specifically looking at the hierarchical organization stage of cells. Now we talked about how cells are the smallest unit of life, and they're considered the smallest unit of life because they can perform all of the required activities of life. So they have genetic information, they can utilize energy, they can interact with the environment and others and so forth. They can evolve. So cells are considered the smallest unit of life. Anything smaller than a cell is not considered alive because it doesn't perform all of the required activities of life. Now, we have 1.8 million species on Earth that have been discovered and classified. There's probably anywhere from, maybe 3 million to upwards of 15 million, maybe even 100 million different species out there that we have not discovered. But we can organize that life based on what type of cell they are. And there's actually only 2 types of cells. So we can take that 1.8 million species that we've identified and break them down into 2 groups, prokaryotic cells and eukaryotic cells. So there's only 2 types of cells. We have prokaryotic cells and eukaryotic cells. And we'll go through the distinguishing characteristics of these two types of cells in chapter 4 of our textbook, so week 3. But just to give you a preview, prokaryotic cells are very simple. Eukaryotic cells are very complex. So you can just see the difference between the two here in this picture. The prokaryotic cell, it's very simple. It's actually a lot smaller too than the eukaryotic cell. So look at the size of this prokaryotic cell. This weird shaped U, that stands for micro. So 1 micrometer, we'll talk about the metric system in lab if you haven't seen it yet. But 1 micrometer, that's really, really, really small. This eukaryotic cell is more than 1 micrometer, okay? So it's going to be bigger than a prokaryotic cell. And also, look inside that prokaryotic cell. Not much going on. There's not even a nucleus. There's DNA or genetic information, but there's no nucleus. The eukaryotic cell has a nucleus, which houses the DNA. So it has organelles, or organs of the cell. And each of these organs has a different function. So the nucleus stores the genetic information. There might be other membrane-bound organelles throughout. Okay, so there might be like a mitochondrium, which is the powerhouse of the cell, or the Golgi apparatus, which is kind of like the shipping and mailroom of the cell, which kind of receives and modifies information for shipment. Okay, so our eukaryotic cells are a lot more complex than the prokaryotic cells. So we'll go into more detail of these later on. Okay. Now, we talked about the hierarchical organization of life. So the next on the list was information. So all living things have genetic information or genetic material. And that genetic material is called DNA, or deoxyribonucleic acid. So that stands for DNA. So deoxyribo, by the way, is a type of sugar, and then nucleic acid is the type of macromolecule this is. So DNA is our genetic material. And does anybody know how much DNA we have? Well, we have a lot of DNA. Okay, we have, our DNA is, I think if we stretched it out, it would probably be taller than me if we stretched out. And that's all in every single cell of your body. So DNA is, it's pretty extensive. And we actually take our DNA as eukaryotes and we divide it into sections, which we call chromosomes. So chromosomes carry our genetic information, our DNA segments. And some of you might already know, but humans, we have 46 total chromosomes in each one of our cells. So a chromosome is just a form of DNA. It's like a unit of DNA that is inside each one of our cells. So we have 46 of them in each one of our cells, and they contain the DNA. So you can see here's the nucleus, and you can even see some of these chromosomes, these blue things. Okay. Now, what do we do with our DNA? So our DNA molecule holds hundreds or even thousands of genes. And genes code for traits. So they can code for things like your heart muscle, or whether we need insulin, or if we have blue eyes. So all of that is carried, those are information, genetic information housed on our genes. And our genes, where do we get our genes from? We got them from our parents, okay? So our genes were located in our parents' sex cells, okay, the sperm and the egg. And those sex cells, they united to form a fertilized egg. So the fertilized egg houses the DNA of 2 different parents, right, through sexual reproduction. And so that DNA is carrying all of the information to make a human being. So that DNA is going to undergo differentiation and divide, and the cells will divide and divide and divide until we end up with a human baby. Okay, so that human baby, the appearance of the human baby, the arms of the human baby, the head of the human baby, all the organs of the human baby are determined by its genes, or his or her genes, and that came from their parents' DNA. Okay, so that information is housed on our genes within our chromosomes, which are found in the nucleus of our cells. Okay, so let's take a closer look at that DNA, and we'll cover more of DNA later in the term, but DNA, deoxyribonucleic acid, is actually, our DNA is composed of 2 strands. So when we look at it, it almost looks like a ladder that's been twisted. So it's in a double helix kind of configuration. And it's made up of 4 nucleotide bases. So basically, our genetic code is a sequence of these nucleotides, and each nucleotide is either, it has an A, a C, a T, or a G on it. So the sequence of these nucleotides will determine what it's coding for, what protein it's making, and what part of the body, and so forth. So gene expression is converting that information that's housed in this DNA sequence to form a cellular product. Okay, and we'll go into detail about how that happens. Probably, it's actually at the very end of the term, so you have to wait for that one. Okay, but here's an example. You can see our double helix. So our double helix is 2 DNA strands, and you can notice that these DNA strands, they basically are just a sequence of those 4 nucleotides, the A, the C, the G, and the T. Okay, and then what happens is that sequence is the information to code for some sort of cellular product like a protein. So when we need more of that protein, the DNA will undergo a process known as transcription. You don't need to know the details of this until later in the term, which produces a type of molecule called RNA, which will then basically dock with something called a ribosome, which is a little protein factory. And the protein factory will read the information that's housed on that RNA to produce the protein that is needed. Okay, so all of our information is housed on genes, and it's used to code different things, okay, or different things in our body. Okay, so we talked about the hierarchical organization of life. We talked about information, so those are 2 common themes of life. And then next we're going to talk about energy and transfer. So if we take a look at this diagram, you can see that energy is passing through different organisms. Okay, so there's a certain flow of energy. And where does the energy come from that powers an organism? Well, believe it or not, it comes from the sun. Okay, so we are actually, if you think about it, all of our energy originated from sun energy. So that light energy comes from the sun. Now, if I go outside, I can stand in the sun, I don't suddenly feel energized. I need to eat to survive, right? So I have to basically receive that energy in a different form. I need to receive it in a chemical form, the form of food. Well, how do we get the chemical form? Thanks to our plants. The plants are the ones that can convert that light energy to the sun to chemical energy through a process known as photosynthesis. So that energy gets transferred and absorbed by the plant and transferred from light energy into chemical energy in the form of sugars. And then the consumers, which we are, basically animals, they can consume a plant and obtain that energy. Or they can consume an animal that consumed the plant to get their energy. So if you notice, energy flow is in one direction. It all originates from the sun, and then it's passed through a plant. And then from there, the consumers can eat the plants, and then the consumers, other consumers can eat the consumers that ate the plants, and so forth. So that energy gets passed along the way. Unfortunately, it's not the most efficient method because most of that energy is going to be lost along the way, which makes it difficult for organisms at the top of the food chain to get the energy they need because of that energy transfer. But it also explains why there's not very many species or not very many individuals in a food chain, they're at the top. There's a lot of producers, a lot of plants, but not very many, I don't know, wolves, the top predator in an ecosystem. And the reason for that is that flow of energy. So energy flow is a common theme of life. So all living things need energy to survive, and they use energy to do whatever they need to do. Another thing about our common theme is that chemical cycling is going to be a common theme of life. So chemical cycling is basically the cycling of chemicals throughout the ecosystem. So we can think of, for example, plants, they can take carbon dioxide and water, those two inorganic molecules, and sunlight, and convert that through photosynthesis into sugar. So sugar then can get into our bodies by eating plants or by eating an animal that ate a plant. So now that sugar that chemical is inside of our body, and we can use it. Okay, and we can build our body parts from it. So once we end up having waste products or dying, or the organism dies, we can recycle that chemical back into the soil to be used as nutrients for the plant. So the chemicals get constantly cycled through the ecosystem. Okay, so chemical cycling is a part of this energy and transfer thing. And then moving on to interactions. So all living things, they interact with each other as well as the physical environment. So take a look at the sea turtle here. So the sea turtle's, hanging out, and all these fish are hanging out with them. So that's part of this ecosystem. Looks like they're in a coral reef system. So he's interacting with his environment. He's swimming along with all of his friends, and interacting with the physical environment as well. So all living things interact with their environment as well as with each other. Rocks, they don't do that, right? Okay. And then the last of our common themes is evolution. So evolution explains why we have such diversity amongst all of our plants and animals and bacteria and all living things on Earth. And it explains why there is so much diversity. It also shows us that even though we have so much diversity, we also share a lot of similar traits. And that can be explained because, well, we came from somewhere. Okay, life begets life. So we all came from common ancestors. And then the differences amongst us can be due to the accumulation of changes that have occurred over time within a population that are inherited, so that we're better suited for the environment that we live in. Okay, so we'll get more into this evolution in just a minute. Okay, so let's get into a little bit more about evolution. So let's start out by looking at the first part. So the patterns of unity and diversity in a living, the diversity of life. So we can see, again, remember how we talked about prokaryotic cells and eukaryotic cells? So all the living species on Earth, we can divide into two groups. Are they made of prokaryotic cells or eukaryotic cells? Well, we can do that, and we can classify those organisms even further. So we can classify all 1.8 million species, and we can place them into just 3 categories or 3 domains of life. So all living things are in one of 3 domains of life. So the first domain is called domain bacteria, and they're made up of, you guessed it, bacterial cells, the different variety of bacteria. And bacteria are prokaryotic, so they all contain just prokaryotic simple cells. The other prokaryotic cell type belongs to domain archaea. So we actually have 2 domains that are strictly composed of prokaryotic cells. So these are all single-celled organisms that are made up of one type of prokaryotic cell. So we have domain bacteria and domain archaea are 2 of our 3 domains of life. And they, notice, are very, very small, and they're all single-celled, and they're all made of prokaryotic cells. The last domain is the domain we belong to, domain eukarya. And eukarya contains, you guessed it, eukaryotic cells. Okay, so they're made of living things that have eukaryotic cells. So we can further divide our domain eukarya into kingdoms. So we actually have more than these kingdoms that are displayed, but we're just going to classify them into 3 kingdoms and then the catch-all group, which we just call the protists. So for the purposes of this class, we have our 3 kingdoms that are the most recognizable, and then the other kingdoms we're kind of placing in this catch-all group called the protists, and they're all made of eukaryotic cells. Okay, if we're talking about a prokaryotic cell, it's either in domain bacteria or archaea. If it's a eukaryotic cell, it's in one of these 4 classifications. It could be kingdom Plantae, kingdom Fungi, kingdom Animalia, or the catch-all group Protists. So just briefly talking about the differences between them. Kingdom Plantae, made of plants, and you'll notice that plants, they look a lot different from animals, but we are still made of the same type of cells, eukaryotic cells. There's a number of differences between plant cells and animal cells, so that's why we're not in the same kingdom. And how do plants get their energy? They utilize sunlight, okay, through the process known as photosynthesis. Animals were consumers, so we have to eat or ingest our food or nutrients to get our energy. Fungi, they're not plants and they're not animals, but they're kind of like the decomposers. So they are, they're not necessarily consumers because they can't eat. I mean, you can't give a mushroom a bite to eat, it's not going to do anything, right? But it absorbs its nutrients instead. So if it's basically, if there's like a dead animal right here, the fungus can absorb the nutrients from that decaying animal. And then the last group is the protist group, and that's kind of the catch-all group. It includes multiple kingdoms, and some of them are unicellular, one single-celled, some of them are multicellular. They're just basically, if we can't classify an organism as an animal, a plant, or a fungus, and it has a eukaryotic cell, we just stick it in this protist group. Okay. All right, so let's do a check for understanding question. Which kingdom comprises mostly unicellular eukaryotes? Would it be archaea, protist, fungi, plantae, or animalia? So which kingdom comprises mostly unicellular eukaryotes? Well, it's a eukaryote, so it's not archaea. Okay, so that one's scratched. So it's one of these 4. So which one did I just say can be unicellular? That would be the protists, okay? All right, so we talked about the classification of life, so let's get into the unity of diversity of life. So all living things, doesn't matter if we're talking about a little single-celled bacteria that's you need a microscope to see, or a blue whale. All living things have DNA. So that's something that unites us as living things. But we also see a lot of similarities between different organisms. So that also provides evidence that accounts for a diversity of life through evolution. Okay, so think of the similarities between organisms. For example, we're in kingdom Animalia, and we're in the family, the order Mammalia, because we are mammals. And mammals gestate, they have pregnancies, and they provide milk for their young. So that's something similar that we share in common with our dog or our cat, because they also are considered mammals. So we have similarities between organisms. And then we can use the evidence of the past to help us explain these similarities. So we can look at the fossil records. So the fossil record has kind of the history of organisms that no longer exist today, and we can see the similarities they house to existing organisms of today. So they kind of show us some evidence that documents the evolution of life over Earth's history. So Earth is, really, really old. Living things have been around for a long time as well. So this brings us to Charles Darwin. So Charles Darwin is considered the father of evolution. But he's not the only one that came up with this idea, but he was the one that published it the first. And he came up with this theory of natural selection. So the idea of theory of natural selection basically means that we have this survival of the fittest. And I'm not talking fittest as in physical strength. I'm talking about the ability to reproduce and pass on your genes to the next generation. So the idea is individuals within a population that are able to reproduce and pass on their genes to the next generation must be better suited for the environment. The ones that don't have the ability to reproduce for whatever reason, they don't get enough food, they can't be able to survive very well because they're not camouflaged, they got predators eating them, whatever the thing is, they're not as well suited. So they're not going to leave behind as many offspring as other individuals within the population. So the idea is that we have survival of the fittest. And in 1859, Charles Darwin published his book on the origin of species by means of natural selection. And this particular book addressed something called descent with modification. So the idea that we all share a common ancestor, we descended from that common ancestor, but we're all different because of modification that's taken place over the years. Okay. So let's just briefly go over the idea of natural selection. So Darwin's process of natural selection involves these three observations. So within a population, there's individual variation. Okay, so in any population, there's individual variation amongst the different members of that population. We also notice that within a population, there's always overproduction of babies, basically, and competition for survival. So because of that competition and the fact that we're all competing for the resources that are available, some will survive and some will not. Okay, the ones that survive will reproduce, passing on those genes to the next generation. Those that don't survive, obviously, they won't reproduce. So they end up dying with their genes left within them. So because of that, only the strongest or the fittest members survive. So that promotes evolutionary adaptation. So the individuals best suited for the environment will leave behind more offspring that are also best suited for the environment. So over time, the population is better adapted to that environment. Okay, so let's take a look. Here we have some beetles. Notice within this beetle population, there's some differences. There's individual variation. You see different colors, for example. And then within this particular environment, we have a selective force. We have a predator. So the predator is going after the prey, which happens to be the beetles, and that prey happens to be the ones that stick out the best, that don't have camouflage. So we see variation within the population, and then there's a struggle for survival. So some are better suited than others for survival. Those that are better suited are going to start to reproduce. The ones that got eaten, well, that light coloration kind of dies with them. So the darker coloration survives. Those guys reproduce and pass on their darker colored genes to the next generation. And then over time, we can see a change has occurred within the population. A couple generations ago, we see some light color. A couple generations later, you see mostly dark color. So the population has changed, and that is evolution. Evolution is just a genetic change over time. So we see a change that has occurred. Okay? And this can help explain the diversity of different species. So here we have, this is at the Galapagos Islands, this island chain that's kind of pretty isolated off of the coast of South America. There's all sorts of different finch species. And those finch species all share a common ancestor, the ancestral finch species. And over time, they have adapted to the the different food choices that are on the Galapagos Islands. So some of them have adapted a beak length that is better for eating insects. Others have adapted a beak length that's better for eating fruit. So over time, they fill specific niches within that ecosystem, or basically they have their own adaptations for their own food source. That way they're not eating all the same thing. Okay, so this diversity is due to evolution, and it explains why there's such diversity, because they're not competing over the same resource anymore. They all eat different things. Okay. Right, so let's go ahead and switch gears now, and let's focus in on how we study biology. So we're going to discuss what science is and understand the scientific method. So let's start out by just defining what science is, which is, it means to know. So of course we're always curious about our surroundings. We want to know more about our surroundings. You know, why are the leaves green? Why does the rabbit hang out under that particular bush, and so forth. So we want to explore the answers to those questions that we might have. And so as scientists, we go through a series of steps called the scientific method, which are very intuitive, but it's a certain procedure that we do in order to answer a particular question we might have about our surroundings. So let's start out by talking about the scientific method. So here's an everyday example of how we form and test a hypotheses. So first off, we make an observation about our surroundings. So for example, let's say you go to grab a flashlight and you turn it on and it doesn't work. Okay, so that's going to lead you to a question. Why doesn't the flashlight work? So this might lead you to a hypothesis. So a hypothesis is some sort of educated guess that you can perhaps test and find out. So, my first instinct might be, well, the batteries are dead. And so I'm answering the question with this hypothesis. The batteries are dead. And you'll notice this hypothesis, it is testable. I could change the batteries and see if it works. And it's falsifiable, meaning that if it's still broken, I can say it's my evidence doesn't support my hypothesis. So the hypothesis needs to be testable and needs to be falsifiable. Okay, so let's say I go ahead and test my hypothesis. So I'm going to make a prediction that if I replace batteries with new ones, that my flashlight will then work. So let's say I try to do that. I test my prediction by changing the batteries. And let's say that the flashlight still doesn't work. So I've gathered evidence to basically contradict my hypothesis that it was not the batteries. In fact, it must have been something else. So my results do not support my hypothesis. So that leads me to another hypothesis. Well, maybe the bulb is burned out. Maybe that's why the flashlight's not working. So then if I replace the bulb, it'll fix the problem. So I go replace the bulb and hey, it fixed the problem. So this time my hypothesis is supported, that it was the bulb that was burned out. Okay, so when we are undergoing the scientific method, we go through this set of procedures. Okay, so here's another more real-world example. We're going to go back to the beginning of the lecture where we talked about these two mice populations, and even though they're the same species, they have different colorations to them. So we start out by investigating coat coloration in the mouse populations. So we observe that the population near the coastline, near the beach, is lighter in coloration, whereas the inland population seems to be darker in coloration. And you'll notice that, the populations are fairly close together. They're not that far apart. So this leads to the question, what accounts for the match between the coat colors of the mice and the color of the sand or soil in their habitat? So what accounts for, the light colored mouse blending, into the sandy soil or substrate, and the darker colored mouse blending into the darker soil substrate? Okay. So my hypothesis might be that the color in the patterns in the mice have evolved as adaptations. Okay, and that I don't know why it's doing this weird thing, so let me just, there we go. Okay, so the color patterns in the mice have evolved as adaptations that camouflage the mice to protect them from predation. So my hypothesis is basically answering this question. So why do I think there's different colors in mice? Well, because of the fact that there's predators around that want to eat the mice, and so having the coloration match the surroundings allows them to have that camouflage. So they evolved those adaptations to avoid predation. So this leads to the next step. So what's the next step in the hypothesis or in the scientific method? We did the question, we did a testable hypothesis. So that leads us to a prediction. So prediction is predicting the results of my experiment. So my prediction is that mice with coloration that does not match the habitat should suffer heavier predation than the native well-matched mice. Okay, so the ones that are not camouflaged, they're going to get eaten. The ones that are camouflaged will be fine. So I'm going to go ahead and conduct an experiment to test my hypothesis and prediction. So in this case, I'm going to do what's called a controlled experiment. So a controlled experiment means that basically we're going to have our test subjects in our experiment, and we're only going to change one factor amongst them. Okay, so it's going to be completely controlled for as many variables as possible, but we're only going to have one difference between the two groups. So my difference I'm going to choose is non-camouflage versus camouflage. So I'm going to have one group be the non-camouflaged mice and the other group be the camouflaged mice. So I have two groups here. One I'm going to call the experimental group because I'm experimenting on them. I'm seeing what the non-camouflage is going to do. And I'm going to compare it to the control group. So the reason why we have a control group is for comparison. If I only subjected non-camouflaged mice to my experiment, then I wouldn't really know if it was the mice, the camouflage that was causing the predation, or if it was something else. So that's why I need to have a control group. And in this case, the control group are the camouflaged mice. So the other thing that we need to understand before we conduct our experiments is we need to identify the independent variable and the dependent variable. So the independent variable is also known as the manipulating variable. It's what we have decided ahead of time is going to be the variable that's different between the two groups. So I have my experimental group and my control group, and what's different about them? It's their coloration. Okay, non-camouflage versus camouflage. So I'm deciding ahead of time that I'm going to have a group that's non-camouflaged and a group that's camouflaged. So that's my independent variable. It's my manipulating variable. The dependent variable is the responding variable. It's the one that I'm going to be basically measuring in my experiment. I'm going to acquire data on it. So it depends on the independent variable. So it's what I'm measuring in the experiment that depends on the independent variable. In this case, it's the amount of predation. So basically, that depends on if it's camouflaged or not, right? So the dependent variable depends on the independent variable. The effect of predation depends on the color of the mouse, okay? So I've decided, my experiment, my experimental group, my control group, I have my independent variable, my dependent variable, and I'm trying to control for the other variables possible so that we're minimizing it, so we just have one variable we're looking at with our controlled experiment. So here's our results. We have, it looks like we have the beach habitat and the inland habitat. And we conducted the experiment on both the beach habitat and the inland. So in the beach habitat, we have our camouflaged mice are the light color. And so that's the control. The non-camouflaged mice happen to be the dark color, and they're the ones that would be the experimental group in this scenario because it's the beach habitat. Now notice we didn't use actual mice, we used models. And then we looked at how often a predator attacked the models. And you can see the difference, okay? So between the light models and the dark models, it looks like the dark models received a higher percentage of attacks. Now, if we compare that to the inland habitat, the coloration is switched, where the camouflage or control group are the dark colored models, and the experimental group are the light colored models because they stick out, they're not camouflaged. And you can see again that the predators attacked the non-camouflaged group more often than the camouflage group. So based on this, the results, I can then accept my hypothesis that the coloration is determining whether or not the predator is going to strike it. So the habitat it's in, if it's better adapted to that habitat, it'll have better camouflage. So here's a checkpoint question for you. Why is it difficult to draw a conclusion from an experiment that does not include a control group? So let's say we only have the non-camouflage group, and we didn't have the camouflage group at all for comparison. What do you think our results would show? Well, let's go back. Imagine if we did that. So we did not have a control group. So we only have basically this data here. Can we prove anything with just this data? Nope. Okay, so the reason why we need that control group is for comparison. That way we know if that variable we're testing, camouflage, coloration, really does have an impact on the experiment we're conducting. Okay. All right, so we've talked about the scientific method, we've talked about hypotheses and predictions and so forth. But a lot of students get a little confused when we bring up this idea of scientific theory. So scientific theory is a lot different from the theories we talk about in everyday conversation. So when we say theory in an everyday conversation, we're actually saying more like a hypothesis. A theory is broader in scope than a hypothesis. So it's going to be a bigger concept that's broader in scope. It's not just, does the mice get eaten if they're not camouflaged? Okay, so that's a very narrow scope. But we can think of a broader theory that, maybe there's individuals or populations are suited to their habitat because of the adaptations that they have, which they acquired through evolution. So that would be more of a theory because it's based on a broader scope. So it's general enough to lead to new testable hypotheses. And it's supported by a lot of evidence, and that evidence tends to be varied. So some examples of theories would be like, for example, gravity is a theory, and you prove it every day, you're providing evidence to support that theory. Germ theory, that there's microscopic organisms that cause disease. Cell theory, that all living things are made of cells, and that cells come from other pre-existing cells. The theory of evolution by means of natural selection. All of those are supported by a large body of evidence. And they lead to new testable hypotheses. Now, does that mean that a theory will never get disproven? It's unlikely that it would ever get disproven because it's such broad in scope and there's so much evidence to support it. Whereas a hypothesis can easily get disproven based on that narrow set of experimental factors you're dealing with. Okay? So here's a check for understanding. Which least describes the practice of science? Is it A, science is typically performed alone in the lab, B, data are typically collected by teams of students and experienced researchers, C, scientists typically re-examine conclusions or repeat experiments from other large famous labs, D, scientists who work in forests studying ecology often collaborate closely with geneticists who work only in the lab, or E, the practice of science results in a discovery that lends new insight and technology involves how this new insight will be applied to develop a new drug. So which one of these describes the practice of science the least? Well, the answer, if you agree with me, is that science is typically performed alone in the lab. Not usually, okay? So we don't, it's usually not just one person trying to answer a question on his or her own by himself, okay? It's a collaborative effort. So we always have teams of scientists working together, collaborating with each other in order to come up with an answer, okay? Here's another question for you. Which of the following levels of life's hierarchy is not appropriate when referring to two of life's domains, archaea and bacteria? So which one of these would not be applied to bacterial cells or archaeans? Is it A, the population level, B, the organism level, C, the organ level, or D, the molecular level? So which one of these does not apply? Well, can we have a population of bacteria? Certainly, there's one right there. Can we have an individual bacterium? Yep, there's one right there. Can we have an organ inside of a bacterial cell? Wait, it's a single cell. It can't have organs. Organs are made of tissues. Tissues are made of cells. So it must be C. Okay, so the organ level. All right. And then here we have Darwin proposed the theory of natural selection. For the most part, natural selection acts as a filtering agent at the blank level of life's hierarchy. Would this be the community level, the population level, the individual level, or the organ level? Yeah, the answer is right there. So it's going to act on the population level. You cannot evolve. You are born with your DNA. It's not going to change much throughout your life. But a population can evolve over time, okay? So populations evolve, individuals do not. Okay, that little beetle cannot suddenly change to a darker colored carapace because he's in the wrong background, okay? So he's born with his set of DNA, and unfortunately, you know, he became a tasty snack. So organisms do not evolve, populations of organisms can. All right, and then we have the three domains of life described by biologists today are the bacteria, archaea, and eukarya, all other forms of life. What is the basic difference between eukaryotes and prokaryotes? Would it be A, prokaryotes do not have a plasma membrane surrounding the cell, B, prokaryotes use RNA, not DNA, to pass on genetic material, C, the interior of the cell of eukaryotes is divided by internal membranes into specialized compartments, or D, eukaryotes engage in cellular metabolism, prokaryotes do not. So which one of these do you think does not apply to our prokaryotes? Do prokaryotes have DNA? Well, yeah, that's genetic information. I didn't talk about it. Prokaryotes not having that. It's something that all living things have. Are prokaryotes made of cells? Yeah, we got a prokaryotic cell, and it's surrounded by something, must be a plasma membrane. Do prokaryotes utilize energy? Yeah, so they do cellular metabolism. It's just C is the difference, okay? So the interior of the cell of eukaryotes is divided by internal membranes into specialized compartments. So they have the different organelles. Prokaryotes do not, okay? All right, so we're going to go ahead and stop here for today. If you look through your course objectives and you notice you didn't answer something, go ahead and try to answer it now, and then you can always use your textbook to help you. The next video will cover Chapter 2, so I'll see you then.